hear about the anxieties of junior year, the jump from 30 to 50 note cards for history papers, beginning the college search, and a new load of stress as junior year becomes the most important year of your high school career. With this in mind, I could not have been more nervous to start my third year at EA. However, after spending 40 minutes in Mr. Zanki's chemistry class on the first day of school, I knew that junior year wasn't going to be as bad as I predicted. Although some might think I only enjoyed class because he allowed me to conduct nearly every single demonstration, I believe it had more to do with his genuine nature and passion for teaching. Whether he is in the classroom or on the bike polo court, Mr. Zanki's passion is undeniable. He demonstrates the stripes every day, particularly generosity, kindness, respect, and sportsmanship. His excitement for life radiates throughout our community, and his enthusiasm is contagious. I think many would agree when I say that it is hard to smile around him, and that if you talk to him for just 1 minute, you are sure to laugh or learn a random fact. If there is one thing Mr. Zanki has taught me through his example, it is to pursue my passions and just to be happy. Please stand to greet Mr. Zanki.
Wow, Weezy, thanks a lot. That was a fantastic introduction. Please be seated. Well, I'd like to thank the vestry, first of all, for this opportunity to speak to you all this morning. My address actually dovetails on to a speech that I gave up in Camp Tecumseh years ago. And the theme of that speech, as I remember it, was along the lines of live free or die. And that's because, of course, we were up in New Hampshire, and that's the state motto up there. But there was a little bit more to that speech, as I recall. And I also talked about the issue of how and when I try to speak with God. And the short answer to that is usually when I'm in big trouble or when there's no one else to turn to. But that's no way really to build a relationship with anyone. Most of you know me as someone who enjoys teaching chemistry and someone who also enjoys a good, clean game of bike polo. Yeah, buddy. But I bet you didn't realize that I'm also way into boats and being out on the water. I guess that my fascination with boats started when I was a kid back up in Canada. I grew up on a pretty big river, and I would occasionally see these really cool cabin cruisers plying up and down the Thames River, which flows into Lake St. Clair, one of the lesser known of the Great Lakes. Both my dad and granddad were also way into boats, and I thought that I'd just share a couple of their experiences with you before I talk more about my passion for boats and being out on the water. My dad's dad was in the Navy when my father was born in 1939, but my granddad and his crew decided that there wasn't much of a future in their Navy and decided to join a new militia instead that was forming at the time in 1941. It was a pretty small group at first. They didn't have many arms to fight with, no official uniforms, not even a country to fight for. They just wanted to fight for their cause. They decided that they were going to take on the Italian and German armies in hopes of gaining an independent form of government from the Nazi puppet regime that was currently in control of the region. In time, their numbers grew, and they were able to acquire more resources to fight with. In the end, my granddad and his crew were successful, and they did rid themselves of that puppet regime. But the conditions in their new and independent country weren't the best. The new government took the form of a quasi-type of communism, and under this new regime, they had gained their independence from their original oppressors, but now were saddled with a new kind of oppression. At the end of the war, my granddad went back to his home on the island of Vis, which is in the Adriatic Sea and in a part of modern-day Croatia. Life was pretty tough back on the island. The work, fishing and farming, was pretty demanding to say the least, and on top of that, it didn't pay very well. By the mid-1950s, my father was about 16 years old when he and his buddies hatched a scheme to get off of that island and go to either France or America. But this plan involved commandeering a little boat and then sailing it to Italy, which lay 100 miles to the west. My granddad kind of knew what my dad and his crew were up to, but he tried to look the other way. This was kind of troubling for him because on one hand, he kind of wanted my dad to have a better life, but he also knew that if they were caught trying to flee for Italy, the outcome was often quite grim, with many previous would-be escape artists being shot on their boats somewhere on the high seas by the current government's navy. Well, my dad and his buddies did manage to make it to Italy. Some of his friends went to France, some to the US, but my dad decided to try Canada. He met and married my mother, bought their first home, and had a couple of children. Then after about 10 years, my dad invited my granddad and grandmother to come live with us in our home in Chatham, Ontario. This all was working out pretty well when my granddad heard that you could make some money out on fishing boats in British Columbia and Alaska, fishing salmon. So off he went, back out to sea for weeks at a time, off on a great adventure. Now in his 50s, at a time in his life when most would be thinking of starting to slow down a little, he entered into a life that was, for the most part, a younger man's game. Around the time that I was about 17, my dad bought a farm on the shores of Lake Erie. Our farmhouse was only a few hundred feet from the crashing waves of the lake, and to my amazement, I could see huge freighters out there on the horizon every day between the shores of Ontario and the state of Ohio. Lake Erie just looked like an ocean to me, and I often dreamed of being over that horizon. Needless to say, my dad purchased a boat that we would go out on from time to time, but we never did quite make it to the other side. One day, I got the smart idea of taking the neighbor's 14-foot aluminum boat, taking it out on the lake. It didn't have a motor, just 2 oars and 2 oar locks. Well, the paddle was just going fine for a few miles, and then I broke one of the oar locks. That was really, really bad. I found myself in the middle of the shipping lanes with huge lake freighters and ocean freighters bearing down on me. Well, it was at that time that I found myself trying to get God's attention while trying to paddle my way out of the shipping lanes and back to land. After a lot of talking, petitioning, and paddling, I eventually did make it back to shore. A few years later, I graduated from the University of Windsor, left the farm, and moved to New York City to teach science. This school was right on the East River, and it was there that I fell in love with sailing on a friend's sailboat. We would go out on Long Island Sound and on the Tappan Zee, and the Tappan Zee is just a really wide part of the Hudson River that's just north of New York City. It was awesome. A couple of years later, I moved to Philadelphia and started teaching at Episcopal. Well, I had been at EA for about 10 years when in 1999 I decided to take a couple years off from teaching at EA and move to California. Then it happened. After spending a year farming in San Luis Obispo, my passion for being out on the water was rekindled when I moved to Santa Cruz, California. This time it was kayaking on the Monterey Bay. I really enjoyed the combination of the surf, the swell, the sea lions, the otters. It was pretty awesome. Which takes us up to the present. I'm still way into kayaking, paddling mostly on the Schuylkill, East River, and Delaware rivers, and in a quest to try and be the change that I would want to see in the world, I'm planning to paddle my kayak down the Hudson River from Albany to New York City and out to the Atlantic this summer. I want to experience the river and its valley from the viewpoint of the waterline, the way that Henry Hudson and the first Dutch explorers experienced it around 300 years ago. I figured it will take me 3 days of paddling, and it will also give me plenty of time to think and reevaluate my relationship with the environment and with God. Just before I came back to teach here at EA, I heard about an organization that was started about 40 years ago by this guy named Pete Seeger. At a time when the Hudson River was very polluted and pretty messed up, almost single-handedly, he was able to raise consciousness about the plight of this beautiful river. The way he did this was quite amazing. He restored an old Hudson River schooner that was used to transport goods up and down the Hudson for more than 100 years. He then took people sailing up and down the river to show them just how beautiful the river and its valley really are. And in doing so, he raised enough awareness to bring about the change that ultimately saved the river from certain death. He still sails that schooner, called the Clearwater, once a year in July during his annual Clearwater Festival. The Hudson is clearly much cleaner than it was before Pete Seeger started his campaign to clean it up, but the river is not entirely out of the woods yet. Millions of people live along its banks, and it's very tempting for those who live along its banks to mistreat it. So I'm planning to do my part to try and help with the ongoing campaign to raise awareness for the river's well-being by paddling down the Hudson during this year's festival around the time that we return from Costa Rica. Maybe during my journey down the Hudson, I can inspire others in some way to perhaps try paddling on the Hudson or try paddling anywhere. I think that when someone gets out on the water, maybe for the first time, without the roar of an engine, they might feel more at one with the world and come to appreciate it in a different way. I know that for me, when I'm paddling down a waterway, my perspective on life totally changes for the time that I'm out there, and often contemplate how fortunate that we are just to be alive and enjoying everything around us. Well, we've come to the end of my little tale, and I only have one thing left to say to you all. Just believe in yourself, and you will never fall. Thank you.